Hello and welcome to the Crime Reel. Today we will be looking at 5 fascinating Australian true crime cases. Let's get started straight away with Hannah Clarke and her family as our first case. In today's true crime narration, we will be looking at the heartbreaking case of Hannah Clarke and her beautiful children, Aliyah, Leanna and Trey, and the crime that would ultimately lead to the Queensland government criminalising coercive control. Hannah was born on the 8th of September 1988 to Lloyd and Suzanne Clarke. Hannah and her brother, Nat, enjoyed a great upbringing. Hannah was sporty, representing Queensland for 4 consecutive years in trampolining, and she also loved the beach and being outdoors. Around 2007, Hannah met a man by the name of Rowan Baxter in Brisbane, Australia. Hannah was 19 at the time, and Rowan, a former rugby player with the New Zealand Warriors, was 30 years old. Hannah was caring and loving, and with Rowan she thought that she'd found someone just like her, and for the first 4 years of their relationship it seemed like she was right. He was dedicated to Hannah and told her about his divorce from his first wife had been so devastating for him that he'd not known what to do. Their relationship progressed and Rowan proposed to Hannah in 2011, and they married the following year in Kingscliff, New South Wales. Following their wedding, it was like a switch had been flipped inside of Rowan. His entire personality and demeanour began to change. Suddenly, Rowan wanted to know where Hannah was at all times. He needed explanations as to what she was doing and who she was going to be spending her time with. Hannah was constantly belittled, and Rowan wasn't afraid of doing whatever he had to do to make sure that her world reduced down, so that he was the only important part of it. He told her how ugly and terrible she looked, called her names, told her what she could and couldn't wear, and he started doing things like making her steal clothes from shops just to prove that he could take control of her. Soon, Hannah had little say in her own life. She had to do whatever Rowan told her to do or suffer the consequences. She was cut off from their bank accounts and given only enough money to buy the groceries and other things for the household. For anything else, she had to run things by Rowan, and he would decide if Hannah was allowed to spend the money she was asking for, even though, by then, both of them worked at and owned a gym in the area. Rowan always wanted to be the alpha male, reportedly training people so hard at the gym that they would vomit. He would tell Hannah to cover up if she wore a bikini, and it was later discovered that he used secret recordings and tracking devices to keep tabs on his wife. With Hannah now under his control, Rowan did exactly as he pleased. He started having numerous affairs and did not even try to hide them, even from friends and family. His cousin, Sandra, remembered a time when she caught Rowan cheating on Hannah. "We were at a family barbecue and he was at the grill, and I walked over to him and he was sending hundreds of texts to other women." I know that Hannah believed she wasn't the only one. Nevertheless, Hannah did her best to try to please Rowan and work through the troubles that they'd been having in their marriage. The couple went on to have 3 children together, 2 daughters, Aliyah and Leanna, and a son who they named Trey. It can be assumed that as the couple became a family, Hannah hoped that Rowan's behaviour would change. Sadly, it didn't, but that doesn't mean that nothing in the relationship did. With 3 young children to protect, Hannah started to stick up for herself, and she told Rowan that she wouldn't tolerate his behaviour anymore. After having become increasingly isolated from her friends and family, they now got more involved and offered Hannah and the children places to stay, even when Rowan came after them and tried to force them to return to him. Hannah had had enough. She reverted to her maiden name, packed the children up in the car and moved back in with her parents. Rowan was furious and resorted to stalking Hannah, spending hours in the shopping centre where both Hannah and his cousin Sandra worked. Sandra would often spot him pacing outside the shop, but Hannah was not prepared to bow down to Rowan's intimidation tactics, and eventually she filed for divorce. Now panicking that he was going to lose his family, Rowan agreed to go into counselling, and he and Hannah entered legal discussions over custody of the children. Rowan was adamant that he wanted joint custody, even going against the legal advice of his lawyer and refusing an offer put forward by Hannah and her legal team that would grant him custody of the children for 165 days of the year, and chose to sign an unofficial document instead. Despite this agreement, on Boxing Day 2019, Rowan kidnapped their youngest daughter from Hannah's family home. The police issued a domestic violence order against him, and this kept Hannah and the children safe for a while. However, in 2020, the courts changed the conditions of the order, and Rowan was once again granted access to his children. Trapped and bound by the law, Hannah tried her best to make sure that the contact that Rowan had with his children was positive and that they were protected from the difficulties that she was having. He was reportedly still going to counselling, and with Hannah and the children still living with her parents, she was able to minimise the impact of their interactions with him. That is until the devastating events of the 19th of February 2020. At around 8:30 a.m. that morning, Hannah packed the children into the car to do the morning school run. Rowan forced his way into the passenger seat of the car and told Hannah to drive. They had only travelled a short distance when he doused both Hannah and the 3 children with petrol. He then set them all on fire, most likely hoping that it would be all over too quickly for anyone to make it out alive. But Hannah managed to. Witnesses saw her jumping out of the car screaming, "He's poured petrol on me." Not knowing what to do or what was going on, a man on the street tried to get into the car and get the children out. However, Rowan was also still alive, and he got in the way, pushing the man back and threatening him until the car was engulfed with flames. The man still tried in vain to get the children out, ending up with burns over his upper body and face. Rowan then pulled out a knife, threatening people on the scene to stay away from the car before stabbing himself in the chest area. He managed to fatally wound himself before first responders could arrive on the scene and save him. His final act being to make sure that he would never be held accountable for his horrific crime. It wasn't possible to rescue 6-year-old Alea, 4-year-old Leanna and 3-year-old Trey from the car. They passed away at the scene of the crime. 31-year-old Hannah was airlifted to hospital. She had burns on over 97% of her body, and while she was fighting for her life, she told them exactly what Rowan had done. Hannah succumbed to her injuries that night. She and her 3 children were buried in a single coffin on the 9th of March 2020. Police interviews with family and friends confirmed Hannah's account of an abusive and possessive husband, and the investigators believed they had enough evidence to confirm this as a murder case. Rowan Baxter's family spoke to the press about how they were shocked and disgusted over his actions, and how they felt guilty just for knowing him. Hannah's family and friends are now working to raise awareness to try to ensure that nothing like this happens to anyone else. They held a vigil at the Bill Hewitt Reserve in Camp Hill, all of them wearing pink to raise awareness against domestic abuse. And Hannah's longtime friend, Nikki Brooks, spoke about Hannah's journey and what they'd all learned from it. "We are a nation of pain," she told the crowd of over 1,000 people, warning them about the dangers of not addressing domestic abuse in time. "Don't back away from your friends for the sake of convenience. Time's up for domestic abuse." A portion of the Bill Hewitt Reserve was later renamed Hannah's Place in honour of Hannah. Her family have also founded a charity called Small Steps for Hannah, memorialising Hannah and her children through the work that they do to try to bring an end to domestic violence in Australia. Hannah was posthumously named one of the Marie Curie magazine's Women of the Year in 2020 in recognition for the work and the progress made by Small Steps for Hannah. The magazine cited the reasons for picking Hannah was for the work that her charity does to highlight the dangers of domestic abuse, including emotional and financial abuse within relationships. Hannah and her children should have had their whole lives ahead of them. She was a great mum, a fitness enthusiast, winning the Australian title in the CrossFit competition for fittest mum. She loved the beach, and as a result of her traumatic marriage had decided that she wanted to become a police officer, as she was inspired by those officers who had supported her at a difficult time. Hannah would ultimately draw strength from her children to give her the courage to escape the years of cruel, manipulative, psychological domination at the hands of the man who should have supported her the most. She paid the ultimate price for her bravery. If you'd like to contribute to the charity, the link is in the description, where you can find out what you can do to help halt domestic and family violence. The website is smallstepsforhannah.com.au/. That concludes today's case. Psst. 1 year after this awful crime, Brisbane paid tribute to Hannah and her children by lighting up the city with the colour pink. That was a colour that she was told she couldn't wear. Goodbye. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the life and crimes of Andrew Mallard. Andrew was born in England on August the 16th, 1962, and emigrated to Australia with his family when he was 5. When looking at Andrew's early life, he seemed a troubled sort of kid and perhaps an easy target. He was very tall for his age and was bullied throughout his time in school, leading to him dropping out at the age of 16. As an adult, he spent 8 months in the army before being medically discharged. After that, he moved around a great deal, including overseas and back again, and drifted from one temporary job to the next. By May 1994, 32-year-old Andrew seemed to be struggling. He wound up in Perth, Australia, where he was mostly couch surfing and using marijuana. To supplement the social security payments he was receiving, he relied on his skills as a con artist and petty thief. There were multiple minor convictions on his record, all of which were for non-violent offences such as traffic violations and stealing. On the 23rd of May 1994, Andrew was arrested in connection with a burglary that he had committed the previous afternoon. In just a few hours, he was charged and then released on bail. Around the same time that Andrew was arranging to have a taxi take him back to where he was staying in Mosman Park, an employee at a nearby jewellery store called Flora Metallica was finishing up her shift, leaving the owner of the establishment, 45-year-old Pamela Lawrence, to run the shop by herself. A short time later, Pamela would be the victim of a brutal attack. At around 6:15 p.m. that evening, Pamela's husband realised that she had not arrived home from work. After attempting to call and getting no answer at the shop, he went to investigate and found her on the floor, barely alive, after a vicious attack to the head. She was rushed to the hospital, but sadly died in the ambulance. At the crime scene, the authorities were puzzled by what appeared to be a random act of violence with no motive to speak of. Despite being surrounded by jewellery, nothing appeared to have been taken from the displays. Pamela's handbag was still there, although it appeared that a wallet containing a small amount of money was missing. This was especially odd because there was a container of cash located in plain view behind the counter, but that remained untouched. If someone had harmed Mrs. Lawrence during the course of a robbery, it didn't make sense for them to leave behind such an easily accessible stash of money in favour of a purse they probably had to search to find. The blood spatter found at the shop suggested that she was first attacked in the front of the establishment and then dragged to the rear. Then she suffered multiple blows to the skull before being left for dead. During her autopsy, the coroner found massive blunt force trauma from a weapon that couldn't readily be identified by the shape of her wounds. What could be identified, though, were flecks of blue paint left from whatever she'd been attacked with. As the investigation continued, a potential witness was discovered. A 13-year-old daughter of a shop employee was driving past Flora Metallica with her grandmother at around 5 p.m. on the day of the murder. The young girl noticed a strange man standing behind the counter in the store. When this stranger realised that he had been seen, he quickly ducked down, but not before the young girl could make out a few specific details, such as his ginger beard and bandana. On the 24th of May, the day after Pamela's murder, Andrew Mallard once again found himself in custody, this time for impersonating a police officer. After being charged with the crime, he was sent to a local hospital for psychiatric assessment. With Andrew's face still fresh in the minds of the police, they quickly considered him as a suspect in Pamela's attack. While in the hospital, he was questioned by 2 detectives on 4 separate occasions. Andrew was unable to give a consistent account of the day of the murder and gave a string of unsupported alibis. Nevertheless, he maintained his innocence and readily agreed to give a blood sample, believing that it would be enough to clear him. On June the 10th, Andrew was released from the hospital and taken to court for the charges of impersonating a police officer. Once he was released on bail, he was taken to the police headquarters where he was interviewed yet again, this time for over 9 hours. Even though there was no physical evidence linking him to the scene, and no trace of blood or other evidence from the scene on his person, which would seem unlikely given the violent manner in which Pamela was beaten, Andrew was charged with Pamela's murder. The main evidence against Andrew was firstly a series of notes written by officers during Andrew's interviews. The officers claimed these notes obtained proof of a confession, but they lacked any sort of signature or written acknowledgement from Andrew himself that he had even said or done the things alleged in them. The other piece of evidence was a 20-minute video recording of Andrew at the end of hours of interrogations. In the recording, Andrew gave a theory on how the killer may have committed the crime. Despite giving this hypothetical idea of what may have happened in the third person, the police considered this as a confession. The jury did too. Andrew was convicted in 1995 and sentenced to life in prison. The following year, his appeal to the Supreme Court of Western Australia was dismissed. In 1998, in a desperate attempt to free him, his family reached out to an investigative journalist named Colleen Egan. Colleen brought the case to the attention of a few experts and officials in the justice system. Together, this group of people explored the case and ultimately came to the conclusion that Andrew was innocent. They became something of an exoneration task force from that point forward and uncovered a wealth of information and evidence to support an appeal. This included multiple police reports that, against standard practice, were withheld from the defence team during the murder trial. The case was taken to the Court of Criminal Appeal for a second time in 2003, and armed with their new information, including extensive details of misconduct during the original inquiry, they believed that Andrew would be freed. However, once again the case was dismissed. Andrew's defence team were granted an appeal to the High Court of Australia in October of 2004, and they prepared to plead their case yet again. This appeal finally began in September of 2005. After examining the evidence, Justice Michael Kirby reportedly indicated that one of the documents the police neglected to turn over to the defence was a forensic report showing Andrew's videotape theory of the murder to be physically impossible. This should have been enough to warrant a mistrial on its own. The decision to overturn Andrew's conviction was unanimous. But even after getting his vindication, his freedom was another matter entirely. For an additional 6 months or so, Andrew remained behind bars due to the Department of Public Prosecution's reluctance to drop the charges after the guilty verdict had been overturned. Finally, just as a directions hearing was approaching, they relented and released him on February the 20th, 2006. After a hard-won 12-year battle to clear his name, Andrew Mallard was a free man. Not everyone was convinced of his innocence, however, and that included Pamela Lawrence's family. He was let go with a warning that, should any evidence happen to surface, he could be prosecuted again. After all, if he didn't kill Pamela Lawrence, who did? Once the charges against Andrew were dropped, the Commissioner of the Police decided to find out. And it was at this time that the palm print of the actual killer on a display counter in the jewellery shop was fully investigated. Back in 1994, at the time of the initial investigation, technology hadn't quite evolved far enough to facilitate a way of identifying unknown partial prints. Years later, it would be a significant piece of the puzzle. For one thing, the shop's policy required that staff wipe down that particular display case after each customer left, meaning whoever left the print was likely to be their suspect. For another, over a decade of advancements in forensic science yielded great returns when they ran another search. This time they got a match and a name: Simon Rochford. Once they knew where to look, it didn't take the investigators very long to find him. Simon, as it turned out, was already behind bars. 7 weeks after the murder of Pamela Lawrence, Simon confessed to the murder of his girlfriend, Brigitte Dickens. Both women appear to have been bludgeoned by the same blunt object, a steel collar meant for use by weightlifters to keep their weights secured. Simon attached this collar, which was painted blue, to the handle of a broom and used it like a club. Upon further inspection of Pamela's autopsy report, it was discovered that the coroner found flecks of blue paint embedded in her wounds, and that the shape of the injuries was consistent with those suffered by Brigitte Dickens. When a bag that belonged to Simon was tested, they found more blue paint flecks, identical to the ones noted in the autopsy. To add an extra layer of certainty, it turned out that Simon more closely resembled the description of the man the shop worker's daughter had glimpsed standing behind the counter at the time of the murder. They finally had the true killer, but a trial would never take place. In the month of May 2006, it was an eventful era in the case of Pamela Lawrence's murder. On the 12th of that month, 5 police officers were let go in light of their conduct during the original trial. 1 week later, on the 19th, Simon Rochford was named a person of significant interest in the case. Mere hours after hearing this news, Simon took his own life, and an officer found him dead in his cell. In October of that same year, the investigation finally came to a close with the Commissioner's announcement that review of the case showed that Andrew Mallard was no longer considered a person of interest. Furthermore, he said there was ample evidence to charge Simon Rochford with the death of Pamela Lawrence. The authorities would have sought his conviction had he still been alive. In this announcement, he also apologised to Andrew for the role that the police had played in putting him in prison. Naturally, compensation was in order for the wrongly accused man. Whilst he received $200,000 Australian in 2006 as a partial payment, the state's Attorney General decided that further restitution would be decided once the Commission on Crime and Corruption had fully investigated the officers involved in presenting misleading evidence against him in the trial. The Commission began its public hearings on July 31st, 2007. This was to address the unethical and borderline illegal actions of the officers and prosecutors in charge of the initial investigation and subsequent imprisonment of Andrew Mallard. Just over a year later, on the 7th of October 2008, the Commission on Crime and Corruption recommended that 2 Assistant Police Commissioners and the Deputy Director of Public Prosecution be officially reprimanded. The 2 officers resigned in the wake of the report, and disciplinary proceedings could then go no further against them. In May of 2009, Andrew was finally awarded a $3.25 million Australian settlement. This is about the equivalent of 2.4 million American dollars.
It's going to be the best Christmas I and my family have ever had for a long time. This is fantastic.
After his release, Andrew earned a degree in fine art, and then he moved to London in 2010 to continue his education. He frequently travelled to Los Angeles to visit his fiancée, and it seemed that his ordeal was finally over. However, his life was cut short when on April the 18th, 2019, he died after being the victim of a hit and run on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood.
The silver sedan never once slowing. His final moments captured on security cameras.
Oh, I'm sorry. No worries. I'm a bit upset.
The 56-year-old, who'd spent the past 13 years of freedom rebuilding his life, was in Los Angeles visiting his fiancée.
He really just wanted to find a family and to settle down and to find someone to love and have that happy ever after, I suppose.
Former journalist Colleen Egan was instrumental in proving Mallard's innocence, part of an investigative team led by the now Attorney General John Quigley.
We thought that we may never prove his innocence, and we always worried that he would die in jail, and that, you know, prison would be the place that he would end.
Andrew Mallard suffered post-traumatic stress disorder from his time in the maximum security Casuarina prison. He was awarded more than $3 million in compensation from the state, but his advocates say he never truly recovered.
His mum and his sister stuck by him all the way through, and really for them to now have to deal with this is very cruel for them.
Now they face another battle to bring his body home to Perth.
It's bittersweet that maybe he was feeling some happiness at the time that he was taken.
Jacqueline Robson, 9 News.
A 19-year-old man was later charged with felony hit and run after turning himself into the police. Andrew was just 57 years old when he died. He had spent a fifth of his life in prison for a crime that he did not commit. As some extra information, a documentary titled Saving Andrew Mallard was directed by Michael Muntz and produced by Artemis International. It first aired on ABC television on the 4th of May 2006. The film focused on Mallard's family and its struggle to have him freed. It also uncovered the deception by the original police investigation team. It was shortlisted for a Walkley Award, and Muntz won the Outstanding Achievement in Directing Award. The documentary also noted at the end that the DPP still considered Mallard a prime suspect in its investigation at that time. That concludes today's case on Andrew Mallard. For today's true crime narration, we shall be looking at an Australian case from 1989, which was described in the press as one of the most brutal and bizarre crimes Australia has ever seen. On the 4th of August 1965, Rhonda Hopkins gave birth to a baby girl who she named Tracey Averill. Whilst she was married at the time of Tracey's birth, a divorce quickly followed, leaving Rhonda in a position where she felt that she was unable to raise the young girl. Tracey was put in the care of Rhonda's adoptive parents, George and Averill Wigginton. George and Averill were extremely wealthy, and Tracey grew up in Rockhampton, a city in northern Australia. Whilst to outsiders it may have looked as though Tracey had a good upbringing, she herself would later state that her grandparents were extremely controlling and physically abusive towards her. She went on to say that George had sexually abused her from when she was 8 until the age of 11. In 1981, when Tracey was 15 years old, her grandparents died, leaving her with an inheritance of around 75,000 Australian dollars. That would be worth more than $300,000 in today's money. Tracey went to live with her mother, but after a series of arguments over Tracey's sexuality, where Tracey was a lesbian and her mother would not accept this, Tracey moved in with a family friend, Kay Worry. It is here that descriptions of Tracey's personality seem to wildly differ. Whilst Kay describes her as a loving girl, gifted artist and devout Catholic, other reports state that she would often exhibit strange behaviours, became sexually aggressive, and was eventually expelled from school for molesting other pupils. By 1982 she had cut off her hair and, at times, began referring to herself as Bobby. Tracey completed a hospitality course at Rockhampton TAFE, Technical and Further Education. and later began working as a bouncer at a nightclub. Tracey met a woman called Sunshine, and the pair soon became romantically involved, with Tracey wearing a studded wristband and collar with a lock, for which only Sunshine had the key. The pair committed to each other in a Hare Krishna wedding ceremony, after which the couple decided that they wanted to have a baby. Tracey sought out a man in order to get pregnant and, in front of a group of her friends, had sex with the club owner where she worked as a bouncer. She fell pregnant but miscarried soon after. It was around this time that she abandoned her faith and became increasingly interested in witchcraft and began corresponding with a white witch in Adelaide. Tracey moved from Rockhampton to northwest Brisbane, where she lived in a flat in Enoggera and worked in a factory. Here she began to immerse herself in the occult and black magic. She became increasingly reclusive and started referring to herself as Fred. She had a black cloth bag which she would use to carry tarot cards, candles and animal bones. She reportedly used blood from animals to draw occult symbols and would draw half animal, half human figures. Tracey became an avid watcher of horror movies, repeatedly replaying scenes in which people were maimed or killed. As her obsession progressed, she began to claim that she was a vampire who was very sensitive to sunlight, could not stand religious imagery, and most sinister of all, needed to feed on animal or human blood, reportedly existing on the blood of pig and goats, which she obtained from the local butcher's shop. By early October 1989, 24-year-old Tracey was in a relationship with a woman by the name of Donna, who had moved into her flat. Their walls were decorated with pictures of graveyards, and a stolen headstone took pride of place in the middle of the room. Nevertheless, Tracey then began an affair with 24-year-old Lisa Paczynski. Lisa had a history of mental illness and was a heroin addict. She had been hospitalised over 80 times in the previous 5 years for self-harming and also for drug overdoses. Lisa was drawn to Tracey's dark personality, claiming to have previously been involved with sacrificing goats. Lisa would wear a tourniquet and then cut herself, allowing Tracey to suck on her blood. On Friday, the 20th of October 1989, Tracey had been repeatedly watching a sequence from a movie where a man had been shot in the head and his skull exploded. She kept watching that scene over and over again in slow motion. That evening, Tracey and Lisa, together with another couple, Kim Jervis and Tracey Waugh, went out drinking at Club Lumors in Brisbane's nightclub district. Kim had previously thought about becoming a nun, but after witnessing Tracey break a crucifix necklace, she believed that Tracey was a destroyer who had the power to rip the arms off anyone who stopped her feeding on blood. Tracey Waugh had been a shy Catholic schoolgirl who believed that Tracey was the devil's bride, telepathic, and could make her body disappear, leaving only cat's eyes behind. The four women consumed a large amount of alcohol before driving in Tracey's green Holden Commodore in search of a victim. Tracey needed to murder someone so that she could feed upon them. They headed to the city's botanic gardens, over the Story Bridge and through Kangaroo Point. It was during this drive that they spotted Edward Baldock. 47-year-old Edward, a married father of 4 and a grandfather, had spent the evening out drinking and playing darts with his friends at the Caledonian Club in Kangaroo Point. More than a little worse for wear, he was holding on to the lampposts as he made his way down O'Connell Street in search of a taxi. Shortly before midnight, Tracey spotted Edward and told Lisa, who was driving, to stop the car. Tracey either offered him a lift or pretended to be a sex worker in order to convince Edward to get into the car with them. He obliged, got in the back seat, and then promptly fell asleep. Tracey instructed Lisa to drive to Orley Park at West End, where they parked the car. Lisa and Tracey accompanied Edward to the riverbank. Lisa kept Edward occupied while Tracey returned to the car, where Kim gave Tracey her knife. Kim always carried a knife for her own protection. Meanwhile, Edward had removed all of his clothes except his socks and put them in a neat pile beside him, and as Tracey returned, Edward was sitting on the riverbank talking to Lisa, facing away from her. Tracey removed the knife from her pocket and then stabbed him in the back, then neck and throat in a brutal attack which left Edward with 27 stab wounds and his head almost severed. She reportedly felt nothing while stabbing Edward to death and sat down to have a cigarette and watch him die. Lisa returned to the car, leaving Tracey to drink Edward's blood in a feeding frenzy that lasted around half an hour. Tracey then washed off her clothes and the knife in the river. She returned to the car and the other 3 women. She then took Lisa and Kim back to look at what she had done to Edward's body. Tracey Waugh remained in the car. As they drove away, Tracey Waugh could smell the blood on Tracey's breath. It was only when Tracey returned to the flat that night that she realised that she had lost her bank card. She returned to the scene of the crime to look for it, but without success. When she arrived back at the flat for a second time, her partner, Donna, recalls her looking sick and pale, with a vacant look in her eyes, like a zombie. Early the following morning, Edward's mutilated body was discovered by a rower. There was evidence that someone had pushed their fingers into some of the stab wounds, and the pattern of the blood indicated that someone had been holding his body to drink from the wounds. It was likely that the first blow inflicted was fatal, and Edward had died minutes later. Edward's wallet containing $35 was found pushed under the door of the nearby sailing club, and Edward's neatly folded pile of clothes and shoes were near his body. In one of his shoes, pushed towards the toes, was Tracey's credit card. It was assumed that in his drunken state he had put it into his shoe, believing that it was his own card, but instead it enabled police to identify his murderers. The police arrived at Tracey's flat, whereupon she told them that she had been down by the river the previous day, but knew nothing of a murder. Despite being pleasant and accommodating, the police were suspicious of her story, and by the end of the day they had started to unravel the truth of the previous night's events. All 4 women were taken into custody and subsequently charged with Edward's murder. Tracey pleaded guilty, whilst the other 3 claimed that they were innocent and that Tracey had occult powers and was able to control them. Psychologists who examined Tracey stated that she had multiple personality disorder and demonstrated 4 distinct personality types: a depressed adult, herself at age 8.5, a callous and cynical 16-year-old named Bobby who was in control at the time of the murder, and an observer who could comment on the thoughts of the other 3 personalities. Tracey underwent hypnosis, and when details were made public, one quote became notorious: "I'd like to slice the top of someone's head and say, 'Think, let me see you think.'" Tracey loved the attention, having been dubbed the lesbian vampire killer, saying to the media, "It's hard to be famous, isn't it? A legend in my own mind." She was sentenced to life in prison, which in Queensland means 20 years or less, with a minimum term of 13 years. She was sent to Brisbane Women's Prison. Her 3 co-accused, Lisa, Kim and Tracey Waugh, tried to claim that they were under Tracey's influence and believed the plan to kill and feed upon someone was just an elaborate practical joke. For the most part, the 6 men and 6 women of the jury did not believe them. They found Lisa guilty of murder and she was sentenced to life in prison. Kim was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 18 years in prison. On appeal, this was then later reduced to 12 years. Tracey Waugh was acquitted after the court decided that she had played no active role in the murder and had tried to prevent Kim from taking part. In 1991, Tracey's mother took part in a media interview where she refuted the claims of vampirism against her daughter. She stated that her daughter was a beautiful, loving, good-natured girl. To her family, Tracey will always be this gorgeous, loving, wacky kid who always used to have us in stitches. Tracey is not evil. She said, "I've killed that man, I've done it, I regret it, and I have to live with it now. She is extremely charismatic, you can't help but like her, she's very popular in jail." In contrast, one former inmate at Brisbane Women's Prison said that Tracey was not like the other girls. She would sit there for hours rolling marbles and grating her teeth. She's evil. She's a strange person in a world of her own. In a prison interview in 1996, Tracey admitted that she was in a blind fury when she stabbed Edward, and in those moments had released the repressed rage from her abusive childhood. She went on to state that murder is a terrifying experience. It's extremely scary to have that much power. It's playing God with life and death. Nobody should have that sort of power, but we all do. 7 years later, there was a public outcry when it was discovered that Tracey had been moved to the minimum security prison farm, Namimba Women's Correctional Centre in the Gold Coast hinterland. After 4 unsuccessful parole applications, she was released on the 11th of January 2012, some 22 years after the murder. This was despite it being made known that she had lied to the parole board, claiming that the victim's family had forgiven her when they had done nothing of the sort. Now walking on crutches and suffering from diabetes, she was held in supported accommodation and closely monitored. Tracey kept a low profile living in southeast Queensland until 2019, when it was reported that she had been seen posting pictures of vampires, demons, witches and bones on Facebook. One post made reference to eating people, saying, "Do not meddle with the affairs of dragons, for you are crunchy and good with ketchup," whilst another stated, "Now panic because I'm back, F." Nevertheless, it seems that she remains a free woman living somewhere on Australia's Gold Coast. That concludes today's story. I would love it if you would consider subscribing to this channel. Please also click like and comment down below. Psst, there are books and TV episodes covering this case as well. Our case today is an absolute tragedy in which 3 young boys lost their lives. However, was this a case of a loving father whose life was destroyed by a freak accident, or a man so calculated that he killed his children, decimating the lives of all those close to him? The Australian courts have decided, but some still disagree. I would be interested to hear your opinions on this case in the comment section below. Robert Donald William Farquarson was born in 1969 and lived in Winchelsea, a small town in Victoria, Australia. When Robert was 22 years old, he met a 20-year-old lady by the name of Cindy Gambino, who worked at a supermarket in his hometown. The couple began dating and later moved in together. On the 4th of October 1994, their son, Jai, was born. Robert, who longed to be his own boss, took a redundancy package from his then employer and bought a lawn mowing franchise business. Their second son, Tyler, was born on 22nd of July 1998, and the couple got married in the year 2000. Money was tight, particularly after the lawn mowing business failed, losing them around 40,000 Australian dollars. After a couple of house moves, they had begun building their own property, which only added to the financial stress. Their third son, Bailey, was born on New Year's Eve 2002. Around this time, Robert's mother had cancer and passed away after a 2-year battle. He was plagued with back problems and started to show signs of depression. By the time he sought help for his problems in the autumn of 2004, Cindy's heart was already out of the marriage, and in November she asked him to leave. Robert then moved back in with his father. The separation appeared to be strained but cordial, and they focused on bringing up their boys. A contractor, Stephen Moule, or possibly Stephen Moules, was working at their house at this time and had become friends with both Cindy and Robert. Stephen was divorced with 3 children of his own. He was a Cub Scout leader and a Sunday school teacher. Whilst his friendship with Cindy remained strictly platonic during her marriage to Robert, Stephen and Cindy began dating after her separation. Robert was concerned that he would be pushed out of his children's lives, but Cindy was adamant that this would not be the case. Cindy and Robert continued to have money issues. Cindy told him that she was not worried about him paying maintenance payments to her, as long as he paid his share of the mortgage. She would rather see him set himself up in a new home for the children's sake, even gifting him some saucepans and a duvet. However, he told Cindy that it would be illegal for him to hold back payments and was angry at the child support agency about the amount that he was scheduled to pay. The couple owned 2 Holden Commodores, and one thing that Cindy wanted was the newer of the 2 vehicles. She thought this was fair as she did the majority of the driving for the children. By this time, Jai was 10 years old. He loved football, cricket and karate, and loved acting out jokes from movies. Tyler was 7. He was also a joker and loved hot dogs and mud cakes. Bailey was now 2 and loved the family pets, a dog who he called Woofy and the cat Puss. On Father's Day 2005, Sunday the 4th of September, Cindy dropped the boys off with their father. She stayed with them while they gave Robert his presents before heading home. Robert took the boys to Kmart in Geelong, where he bought a cricket ball for Jai and videos for Tyler and Bailey. After that, they had a fried chicken dinner. Robert then headed back to their mother's house. As he travelled along the Princess Highway between Winchelsea and Geelong, his white 1989 Commodore veered across the oncoming lane, crashed through a wire fence, travelled through some long grass before running into a farm dam. The car filled with water and submerged. Robert managed to escape just before the car sank to the bottom of the dam, but his 3 sons were trapped inside. 22-year-old Shane Atkinson was driving with his friend Tony McClelland when they saw Robert dripping wet at the side of the road, trying to attract attention. The men stopped to see what had happened and tried to make sense of Robert's babbling. He kept on saying he'd killed his kids, had to go home and tell Cindy, asking, "What have I done?" He told the men that he had had a coughing fit and blacked out. He was panicking and couldn't catch his breath. Shane tried to get Robert to call the police, but Robert refused to call anyone until he had told Cindy what had happened. The men said they would go to the dam and look for the children, but Robert didn't want them to, insisting that he must tell Cindy. Shane agreed to drive Robert back to Winchelsea, and Shane would later say that doing that was the stupidest thing of my whole life. When Cindy opened the door that evening, she was expecting to see her sons returning from their Father's Day visit with Robert. Instead, he stood before her, dripping wet, saying, "I've had an accident. I couldn't get the kids. They're in the water. It's too late." Cindy called Stephen to meet her at the dam, and together with Robert raced to get back to the sunken car. At some point, Robert told Cindy that he had had a coughing fit and could not stop. When he woke up, he said, "I thought we were in a ditch. I told the kids to wait there." At the edge of the water, Robert asked Stephen for a cigarette. Stephen was furious. "What? Where are your kids? Get out of my face before I kill you. Where are your kids?" Stephen dived into the water and began searching for the children. Help began to arrive, Stephen's parents, the emergency services who Shane had called, and also some passers-by. Stephen continued to dive into the pitch-black water. 2 other men climbed in, secured by a rope. A police helicopter illuminated the ground below. Cindy was taken to sit in the front seat of Stephen's parents' car as the search continued. She recalled Robert standing in front of the car with his arms crossed. There was no movement, no nothing. He wasn't doing anything. He was just like in a trance. As the search continued, Robert was treated by a paramedic at the scene. He was given oxygen and then taken to the hospital for examination. The emergency room doctor, Bruce Bartley, examined Robert and made a provisional diagnosis of cough syncope, which is defined as extreme coughing that leads to a brief period of unconsciousness. At around 10 p.m. from his hospital bed, Robert gave a statement to Police Sergeant Rohan Curtis. He said that he started coughing and blacked out. The next thing he knew, Jai was screaming and he was in the water. Jai had opened the door and the car nosedived. He said that, "I tried to get them out and I tried to get out to help. Everything just happened so quick." A second policeman asked him gently, "Do you realise that the children did not make it out of the car?" To which Robert said, "I gathered that." Robert said that he went under the water 3 or 4 times but decided it was better to get help. He also told the officers that he had been on antibiotics and had had about 8 days off work over a throat infection that had left him with a troublesome cough. I think the kids were a bit cold, so I put the heater on, and of course it must have warmed up, and I started coughing. Several times he asked the police what would happen to him. I've never been in trouble before, so what's the scenario for me? And what sort of thing's going to happen to me now, like? During the recording there was no evidence of tearfulness or any other overt sound of distress, nor was there a single cough. Meanwhile, police divers continued their search of the dam, which by now, due to the time that had passed, was considered a retrieval of bodies and potential crime scene. The water was cold with zero visibility and had to be searched by touch. At around 11 p.m. the car was found vertical in the water, with its bonnet pressed into the mud at the bottom of the dam, which was about 7.4 metres deep at that point. Jai was found face down across the front seats of the car, partway out of the driver's door. Tyler was found in the back behind the driver's seat, and Bailey was tangled in the straps of his child seat on the rear passenger side. The heater, ignition and headlights were all switched off. By 8 a.m. on Tuesday the 6th of September, the Major Collision Police handed the investigation over to the murder department, and Robert was interviewed later that day. During the interview he retold the story of what happened in the dam, without mentioning diving to find the children, instead saying that he went straight to get help. When asked why he hadn't mentioned diving to get to his children as he had done in his previous statement, he then said that he had, but could do nothing because of the water pressure. When pushed further about whether he dived, he said, "I'm pretty certain I tried to dive. I think I went. Yeah, I did go down, because I remember. I think I was swallowing a little bit of water." Robert did not know why the headlights were off and couldn't recall touching the ignition. He told the police that he had had coughing fits before, but had never blacked out as a result of them. When asked if he crashed the car deliberately, he replied, "No, I did not," adding that the children were my life, my world. Investigators were very suspicious of Robert, but Cindy was not. They attended the funeral together, bound by their grief. She even stood by him when, on the 14th of December, he was arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder. Cindy stated that, "I believe with all my heart that this was just an accident, and that he would not have hurt a hair on their heads. I don't believe this is murder." The case went to trial at the Supreme Court of Victoria on the 21st of August 2007. It lasted 6 weeks with nearly 50 witnesses being called. The prosecution argued that Robert's version of events did not match the physical evidence gathered from the crime scene. They also brought in a witness, Greg King, who was one of Robert's oldest friends, who provided details of a conversation that he claimed to have had with Robert a couple of months before the children died. Greg said that Robert talked of his anger towards Cindy, the fact that she had the newer car, that she was in a relationship with Stephen, and that he would have to pay for them to live together in his house. Greg claimed that Robert said that he was going to take away the things that meant the most to her, the children. When Greg questioned him on this, "What would you do? Would you take them away or something?" he claims that Robert stared into his eyes and said, "Kill them," adding that he would do it on a special day, saying, "And then every Father's Day she would suffer for the rest of her life." Greg assumed that it was all just talk with Robert and did not take any action until he heard about the accident, at which time he then contacted the police. The police got Greg to wear a secret recording device and attempt to get Robert to recall this previous conversation. During these tapes, Robert claimed that what he meant by paying Cindy back was for him to get a new woman, have a new house, and a successful business, so that Cindy would regret letting him go. Robert insisted that he was telling the truth about the accident. When Greg said that he would have to talk about the accident with his therapist, Robert said, "Yeah, but for God's sake, please don't mention that sort of stuff, because then they're going to have it on a file, and they're going to have to go to the police with that. That's going to incriminate me, and I don't want that because it's not true. I'm begging you not to mention anything." The prosecution argued that Robert was exhorting Greg not to tell the truth to the police. Matthew Norton, an associate professor and specialist in sleep and respiratory medicine, told the jury that it was highly unlikely Robert had had a coughing fit in the moments before the accident. He further testified that cough syncope was an extremely rare condition and that Robert was unlikely to have had such an attack while driving given the warmth of his vehicle, further noting that Robert wasn't coughing on the night when exposed to cold air in wet clothing. On the other hand, the defence presented the case that Robert had lost consciousness due to a coughing fit and woke as the car was submerging in the dam. Cam Everett, the owner of the property where the dam was located, said that 7 vehicles had crashed through his farm fence in 8 years, although Robert's was the first one to end up in the dam. The defence noted that Greg's wife, who Greg claimed to have told about his conversation with Robert on the day that it happened, had no recollection of this. Whilst Greg claimed that he was 80% confident that his recollection was accurate, Robert's defence team suggested that he could not distinguish between facts and visions because his memory had been distorted by his emotional trauma. Cindy told the court that she did not believe her ex-husband intended to kill their children. A former police superintendent contradicted the prosecution's evidence regarding the angle the car would have left the road, making the accident, as told by Robert, plausible. A thoracic medicine specialist, Chris Steinfort, concluded that it was highly likely that Robert had cough syncope on the night of the accident. Chris believed the symptoms experienced by Robert were a classic example. He was slightly overweight and a smoker with a pre-existing flu-like illness. The most favourable witness regarding Robert's behaviour was Gregory Paul Roberts, a social worker and grief counsellor who had more than 70 consultations with Robert since the children's deaths. Gregory claimed that Robert's behaviour on the night was normal for someone who had been through what he had. Adrenaline and shock might have caused him to sound incoherent and later robotic, appear emotionless, or fail to take in information, adding that if a person had been unconscious, a lot of the disorientation would be heightened. Gregory argued that when one partner is present at the death of a child, that partner will have a strong urge to contact the other parent, and because of the overload of information, they can become hyper-focused on this. Once Robert returned to the dam, he would have been exhausted and possibly disassociating from what had happened, making him appear detached. On Tuesday, 2nd of October, the 5 men and 7 women of the jury began their deliberations. 3 days later, they were ready to return their verdict: guilty of murder. Cindy broke down as the verdict was announced. Her mother fainted. Both had to be taken to hospital by ambulance. Robert looked stunned. He was sentenced to 3 terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. He announced that he intended to appeal his conviction. On the 17th of December 2009, his conviction was unanimously overturned by 3 appeal judges who were critical of the judge, prosecution, and Greg King's evidence at the original trial. Robert won the right to a retrial. He was bailed on the 21st of December and released into the care of one of his sisters. The retrial began on the 4th of May 2010 and testimony lasted 11 weeks. At the end of the trial, Robert was convicted of 3 counts of murder for a second time. He was once again sentenced to life in prison, but with a minimum term of 33 years. Additionally, he was ordered to pay Cindy $225,000 Australian dollars for grief, $75,000 per child. After the second trial, Cindy said, "Looking back now, I wonder what on earth I was thinking. But I was in so much pain after losing the children that those first couple of years were a blur, and denial was my only way of surviving." Cindy went on to marry Stephen, and they had 2 sons together. On the 10th of May 2022, at the age of 50, Cindy passed away after suffering a medical episode at home. While Cindy initially fully believed in her ex-husband's innocence, she eventually totally believed in his guilt. What do you think? As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. For this week's true crime narration, we shall be looking at the harrowing case of the Lin family from Sydney, Australia. Min Lin was born on the 28th of July 1963 in Fujian, China. His future wife Lily was born less than 2 years later on the 13th of February 1965. Min and Lily both independently left China to live in Australia when they were students. They met in Sydney in the late 1980s, fell in love and started to build a life together. The couple had 3 children, a daughter named Brenda, who was born in 1994, and then 2 sons, Henry and Terry, who were born in 1997 and the year 2000 respectively. Min opened a newsagent's and poured his heart and soul into this business, working extremely hard to provide for his family. Every day without fail, he was at the mall serving customers in his shop. The Lin family lived in North Epping. It's a quiet suburban part of Sydney, together with Lily's sister, Irene. They were a close family and the children had a happy childhood, surrounded by extended family. After the Lin family found their success in Australia, they wanted to make sure that the rest of their family was taken care of as well. Min helped his parents make the move from China to Australia. His parents settled in Marylands, approximately half an hour from North Epping. Additionally, his sister Kathy and her husband Robert Z had made the move from China to Australia, and they lived around 300 metres away from the Lin's house. On the morning of the 18th of July 2009, Min's sister Kathy received a call from a worried customer. They were asking about the newsagents. It had not opened that morning, which was extremely unusual because Min was so reliable. Kathy and Robert decided to visit Min to see what was happening. When they arrived at the house, the front door was unlocked, and when they went inside, it was soon clear that something terrible had happened. At around 9 a.m. that morning, Kathy called the emergency services by dialing 000. It was clear in that call that Kathy was in a frantic state and unable to clearly communicate with the dispatcher, who immediately sent the ambulance and the police services to the scene. Once the authorities arrived, they found Kathy alone in front of the Lin family home. Robert had gone to collect Kathy and Min's parents from their home in Marylands. The paramedics and police walked into a horrific crime scene. The walls were covered in blood, and the first responders soon realised that no one in the house was still alive. 2 bodies were found in the main bedroom, and a further body was found in a bedroom further along the hallway. In the beds in the children's rooms, a 4th and 5th body were discovered. The faces of the victims had been so disfigured by the brutal attack that it was not possible to immediately confirm their identities. But, as suspected, the bodies belonged to 45-year-old Min, 43-year-old Lily, Lily's 39-year-old sister Irene, and Min and Lily's 2 sons, 12-year-old Henry and 9-year-old Terry. It was later concluded from the evidence at the scene that the 2 boys had been killed last and had tried to fight back against their killer. Brenda, the couple's 15-year-old daughter, was not in the house. Brenda was on a Year 10 school trip with Cheltenham Girls High School visiting New Caledonia. Before she could be located and officially told about what had happened to her family, one of her school friends saw the news on Facebook. This was how Brenda found out that her entire family had been murdered. She immediately flew back to Sydney. It was established that the crime had taken place during the night while the family were asleep. Robbery was soon ruled out as a motive, as the house wasn't ransacked and nothing had been stolen. Locks and windows were intact, suggesting that whoever killed the Lin family had a key or knew them personally. The family had been bludgeoned with a heavy object, but a murder weapon was not found at the scene. After examination of the victims, it was determined that the killer probably used a hammer, and also that 4 of the 5 victims had been asphyxiated before being bludgeoned. 24 identical footprints were found throughout the house, with a shoe size of between 8.5 and 10.5, indicating that there was only one attacker. This also supported the theory that the attacker knew the family as there was no blood or bloody footprints in Brenda's room, presumably because the killer knew that she was not in the house at the time of the murders. There were no fingerprints found, only smudges in the blood, suggesting that the murderer wore gloves. On the 8th of August 2009, a funeral service was held at the Badgerry Pavilion at Sydney Olympic Park with hundreds of people in attendance. 15-year-old Brenda attended with her Aunt Kathy and Uncle Robert. With Brenda having nowhere to go, Kathy and Robert took her in. The Z family soon became Brenda's legal guardians, and they also took over the running of Min's newsagent business. Meanwhile, the police continued to investigate. After analysis of all the evidence, they ruled out a random attack, with the evidence pointing to a family member or friend. They began to look closer at Kathy and Robert. Robert and Kathy had originally settled in Melbourne when they had arrived in Australia. They opened a restaurant, but this business failed, at which point they moved closer to Kathy's family in Sydney. It soon became clear that Robert was annoyed by the lack of respect that he was given by members of their extended family, particularly in comparison to Min. During police interviews, Robert appeared to be very anxious. On the other hand, Kathy was calm and gave investigators straight answers. She provided an alibi for her husband at the time of the murders, confirming that he had been at home with her. However, even with this alibi, they did not cross Robert's name off of the suspect list. A surveillance operation followed, where the police installed cameras in the Z household looking for suspicious activity. And they found something quite strange. In May 2010, Robert was seen tearing up a shoebox and flushing the pieces down the toilet. The shoebox belonged to some Asics trainers that were a perfect match to the footprints found at the crime scene. Furthermore, they were a size 9.5. Learning that Robert had cleaned his garage on the morning after the murders led to increased suspicion, and 10 months after the murders, a forensic examination of the house uncovered a tiny drop of blood in the garage. Analysis confirmed that this small drop of blood contained the DNA of 4 of the 5 victims. Just by itself, this wasn't rock-solid evidence, because it was already known that Robert had entered the Lin household when he and Kathy had discovered the murders. As they continued to build their case, it would take another year before the police were in a position to arrest Robert Z. He was taken into custody at around 9 AM on May the 5th, 2011. He was denied bail and his trial was set for September 2013. In July 2013, 2 months before the trial was due to start, it was then changed to March 2014 by the Supreme Court of New South Wales. At the time, no reason was publicly given for this delay. In May 2014, it was reported that Robert had told a fellow prisoner, who would later become known as Witness A, that he had bought the hammer that he used in the attack in a $2 shop, as this particular shop only had dummy CCTV cameras. He also stated that he planned to use DNA to implicate someone else for his crimes. This information was used by the prosecution at trial, but the defence discredited it on the basis that Witness A was a serial offender who had spent most of his life in prison. This witness had also been offered a substantial reduction to his own sentence in exchange for his testimony. The trial eventually began in August 2014, but then had to be aborted due to the judge's health issues. A new trial began in February 2015. The prosecution presented a solid case against Robert. He had a key to the Lin's house and had been seen attempting to dispose of a shoebox for shoes which matched the bloody footprints. Furthermore, he left the crime scene to pick up his in-laws, which the police suspected he used as an opportunity to throw away the murder weapon. Not to forget that Robert knew that Brenda was on a school trip, which could explain why there were no footprints in her room. He was familiar with the layout of the house, and the prosecution suggested that he had sedated his wife on the night of the murders, enabling him to leave the house undetected. his jealousy of the Lin family and their successful business compared to his own business failings and financial issues was seen as a motive. However, Robert's defence team claimed that there must have been more than one killer, and it would have been physically impossible for 5 foot 7 inch, 60 kilograms Robert to restrain, attack and kill 5 people by himself. They disputed the DNA evidence which had been presented by the prosecution and claimed that Robert had only disposed of the shoebox because he feared being falsely implicated. Kathy stood by her husband, stating that she believed he was totally innocent and that he was being framed for the murders. In December 2015, 10 months after the start of the trial and following 11 days of deliberations, the jury confirmed that they could not reach an agreement. The jury were dismissed and the trial was rescheduled. Meanwhile, Robert was granted bail. A new trial began in June 2016, and once again the jury struggled to come to a unanimous agreement. Justice Fullerton decided to accept a majority verdict. After 8 days of deliberations, it was agreed by an 11-1 majority that Robert was guilty of 5 counts of murder. On the 13th of February 2017, he received 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. It was later revealed that the 2013 trial was delayed because of the emergence of evidence of sexual abuse committed by Robert. Although anonymous at the time, the victim would later speak out about her ordeal. It was Brenda Lin. Robert, her uncle, was obsessed with her and had been abusing her before the murders and continued to do so after he had murdered her entire family and Brenda had moved into his house. The judge at Robert's sentencing addressed the evidence of sexual assault, stating that his depraved obsession with Brenda drove him to kill her entire family so that she would end up isolated and living under his roof. In February 2021, Robert's appeal was dismissed and he remains behind bars. Kathy continues to believe in his innocence. That concludes today's case on the Lin family. Please like, comment and subscribe and tell others about the channel. Thanks very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye. Psst. Did you know that 90% of Australians live on the coast? What interesting facts can you share about Australia? Goodbye.